Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be exploring the rise of feudalism in Japan, as well as the development of new types of Buddhism that are unique to Korea and Japan. So let's start with a definition of feudalism, especially one that is very appropriate to this time period. So feudalism is a decentralized control of a region in which that region is broken down into small self-sustained manors or land complexes that at this point in history rely heavily on warriors for protection. So it is both a social and economic system, and we'll see that there's different forms of feudalism throughout the world, but this is a unique case because of how, for Japan, and as we'll see in Europe as well, that it aligns with a time period of a lot of war and instability, which is where the warriors come in and why they become so important. What we do see in this time period is that land is allocated via a regional monarch or somebody who has a great deal of centralized power. They bestow that land onto the nobility, and the nobility then rely on the military to protect that land. And then the nobles allow a class of peasants to work on that land in exchange for that loyalty as well as that protection by the warrior class. We'll see that the Japanese peasants have a great deal more freedom than when we eventually study the European peasants, or better known as serfs, who don't have very much freedom. Under feudalism, social mobility is very difficult. It's very rare to see someone who is a peasant rise up to the ranks of nobility. Not to say that it's impossible, but it's very, very difficult. People are generally kind of stuck in their social positions. So for Japan, why we descend into this era of feudalism has a lot to do with the rise of the nobility. So in the Heian period, which we learned a little bit about before, what we saw is that China was growing to be extremely influential, and because trade was beginning to blossom between China, Korea, and Japan, not only are we seeing a population growth in the region because of new foods coming in and other supplies, but also the nobility is increasingly wealthier. And as they get more money, they begin to raise their own personal militaries. Those personal militaries help them not only kind of hunker down into whatever region that they are lording over, but it allows them to become more independent from the emperor, who does exist throughout this time period, but becomes far more of a figurehead. So this is where we see the rise of the samurai, who we will talk about, and also, as I previewed, the Japanese peasants, because they were always free. They did not descend from a slave class, which is what will happen in the European context. So since they've always been free, they will continue to enjoy more freedoms, even if they don't necessarily become very rich or see a lot of social mobility in this time period. So, as noted, feudalism in Japan happens as the emperor is losing power to the nobility, and we start to see these clan wars as these noble leaders begin to compete with one another. The military leaders are really the ones who have the most power in this time period, and the military leader, kind of like a general, is known as a shogun. So the shoguns throughout Japan are super powerful, and here are some illustrations of shoguns in very ceremonial garb. So we can see these are two separate people. The colors that they are wearing align with the clan that they are a part of. And like I said, this is more ceremonial gear. These would not be outfits that make a lot of sense to actually fight in, but any sort of ceremony, they would wear this very elaborate garb, which these more elaborate headdresses to kind of show their status and their clan connection. So the shoguns have the power. And just to give us a sense, all the land areas that are marked with different colors are the ones are different shogunates, essentially, that are holding down land and are competing against one another up through like the late 1500s. So I have here on the caption that all these states are fighting one another. It isn't consistent fighting, but it can be very intense fighting. So this is showing us just how decentralized Japan is and how many independent militaries exist throughout the archipelago. So as every class, really class system in general, but especially the feudal systems, we have a very specific hierarchy of power. So at the very, very top of the hierarchy is technically the emperor, but as I said, he's a figurehead who nobody's really listening to. So, yes, he's up there as almost like, I don't know, like a nicety. But underneath the emperor are the shoguns, and they're the military leaders, right, who are ruling over these decentralized clans. Underneath them are the daimyo, who are the lords or the nobility, who are in charge of the land and are protected by the shogun and thus loyal to the shogun. The elite warrior class are the samurai, and the samurai make up the bulk of the military. They're the paid soldiers, as it says here. There are a class of people called the ronin, who are masterless samurai, meaning they kind of go between the different clans. They are much smaller in number, and they usually emerge because of some dispute or the collapse of a particular clan or house, and so they no longer have their master. The largest percentage of people belong to the peasants, right? They're 90% of the population. They are farmers and fishermen, as it says there. What's interesting is that underneath them, even though they might actually make more money, are artisans and merchants. So this is reflecting the Confucian ideology of the Japanese, and a lot of Confucian societies believe that craftspeople and specifically merchants are the lowest on the hierarchy. If we were to rank this based on wealth, they would definitely be probably by the samurai, maybe and above the samurai. But the idea is that they are not as valued because what they are doing is they're taking advantage of the work of everybody else. So for example, the artisans would not be able to do whatever their crafts are, whether they are potters, whether they are sword makers. They wouldn't be able to do any of that if it weren't for the peasants doing most of the labor, growing the food, mining the resources, whatever it might be. So since they would never be able to thrive without the peasants, they are ranked lower than the peasants. And the merchants are considered the lowest of the low because they are not actually producing anything for society. They sell stuff that other people produce. So they're almost seen as like leeches in society, even though, of course, they would be wealthier. But this is showing us that your distinction or your value is not matched to your wealth. It's matched to what are you contributing to society. So this is more the same, but just to kind of give us a little bit more of a simplified sense of the feudal system. To me, this is like the most important thing that you need to know. The emperor having no real power, the shogun being the general, the daimyo being the nobility, the samurai, and then the peasants. And I want to highlight in terms of the peasants is that they had a lot of rights. They were actually paid wages, and they could protest if they felt that they were not being treated fairly by the daimyo. They lived on the manors that they lived in are called the shoen, and they're managed by the nobility. And this is actually a map. You can see it's deteriorated over the centuries, but this is a map looking at the breakdown of the land in each shoen. So if you really were to zoom in here, you can see it's a perfect grid, and each one of these squares belongs to a peasant family. And by belong, I mean they kind of rent it out to a degree. It's not like owned by them. But they work that land and they get to keep most of the profits or the products that they produce off of that land. So what we see in the Japanese system is that the peasants do have a good amount of agency over their lives, and there was an equal field distribution system so that the peasants had enough. So I want to talk a little bit about the samurai because they're so cool and interesting. This is a photograph of the samurai much later in history, obviously, because it's a photograph. And again, we can see this particular samurai is wearing a lot of ceremonial gear, as wearing some of these masks and this particular helmet would not have made a lot of sense within battle itself. But here he's showing off all the fine clothing and armor and weapons that the samurai would have worn. So the Japanese samurai, just a few things that I want to say about them, is that they are the elite warriors of Japan, and they went through a great deal of training, and they were upheld, and they held up the Bushido Code, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. They were considered the protectors of their realms, and they served the daimyo very, very loyally. They backed up the authority of the shogun and gave him power over the emperor, since the samurai are indeed serving the shoguns themselves. They learned to fight in a very efficient way through long-term training that started when they were young and continued into their early adulthood. And it's very much based in martial arts, and they have a lot of famous weaponry, which I'll talk about one example in just a second. But it also should be noted that they were very educated within the Confucian ethic and ideology. They were expected to be able to read and write literature. And they were also very devoted to Zen Buddhism, which we'll learn more about later. So the one weapon that's kind of most famous is the katana sword, which is their long sword. And there's also the wakizashi, which is a shorter blade there. These are said to be like the greatest swords ever. And a samurai would always have these two swords on them because that was they were assigned to them. It's believed that the samurai have to have them on them, otherwise it is a dishonor. And because of the code of Bushido, only samurai weapons are allowed to be used by the samurai themselves. And later on in history, when things like gunpowder show up in Japan, the samurai are technically not allowed to use it because it's not a part of their history and a part of their legacy. Something to keep in mind for later in history. So the Bushido, or the Samurai Code of Honor, is super, super important, not only to the samurai, but it begins to have a big influence in Japanese culture in general. So there are 7 virtues of Bushido, and I'll talk about a few of them somewhat in depth. The first is honor, and honor really goes to everything. The idea that warriors have only one judge of honor and character, and this is themselves. And the idea that they need to be so rooted in Bushido, in Confucianism and Zen Buddhism, and in their absolute loyalty, which is the last of the virtues, the loyalty to their shogun and whoever that they are sworn to protect, that all of that should drive their actions, their decisions, everything. They need to uphold righteousness. So it's not just about honoring someone and protecting them because you're sworn to, but you're supposed to really believe in what they stand up for. Heroic courage is also very important. The samurai are said to be extremely, extremely heroic. It's said that the samurai every morning would meditate on their own death and think every day about dying as to prepare themselves for that inevitable moment. But they're also expected to be compassionate, especially for the working people or for people who need their protection. So they're not supposed to be these big brutes. They're actually supposed to be pretty loving and kind on top of fierce and brave. But this last point, loyalty, really is intense for the samurai. So we see this in the practice of seppuku, and a form of that is known as harikiri or belly slicing. So if ever the samurai committed a dishonor, or if they were dishonored somehow or another, or if let's say they were captured by an enemy, they would be expected to commit seppuku, which is a form of ritualized suicide. So this is pretty difficult to talk about and to maybe hear, so I won't go into too much depth, but we'll just say that this was considered the only honorable way to die if you were in particular situations. And so the samurai, when committing seppuku, would use one of his ritual daggers and then kneel, whether he's kneeling in front of the Lord that he serves, because maybe it's believed that the samurai dishonored the Lord himself, and so he would do this in front of a crowd to show his restoration of honor. Sometimes they would do it in sacred places, like sacred forests. But it was expected that they kneel and use their dagger to essentially disembowel themselves. And they would be expected to remain very stoic in this process. So to not cry, to not flinch, to not scream out. Sometimes another samurai would assist them in decapitating the person committing seppuku if they were beginning to cry out, or which would have further dishonored them, they believed. Or if the process was taking too long, they would decapitate them to end their suffering, essentially. So this is the extent of their loyalty. This is the extent of the intensity of the samurai, that they would participate in something so extreme. I also want to note that women were sometimes trained as samurai, and they were known as the onobugeisha, shown here as a woman illustrated working with a weapon, and they were expected not only to train with weaponry, but also to abide by their version of the bushido. They did not ride into battle all the time or anything like that, but they fought only when necessary, when there was like an extreme invasion, or let's say that a group of enemies broke into a home when the samurai were away. They wanted the women to be able to defend themselves. And so what we'll see whenever we get to the European stuff is that this contrasts greatly with the European form of feudalism, and specifically the European chivalry code, which is what the knights adhered to. Because in Europe, women were seen as like inferior and in need of protection. But here we see in Japan that women were emboldened and encouraged to defend themselves. So now I want to talk a little bit about the rise of what's called Chan or Zen Buddhism, which is essentially the same form of Buddhism, but takes on a different name based on where we're talking about. So in far northern China, this form of Buddhism emerges because people began to essentially kind of get tired of the scriptures and the dogmatic religious rites that were developing within Mahayana Buddhism. And what they wanted to do was get to a simpler form of Buddhism. The term Chan translates to meditation. And so even though meditation is always important in Buddhism, this form of Buddhism wanted to simplify the Buddhist practice to get rid of, like I said, everybody studying these scriptures and all these rituals that started to develop, like, praying to these Mahayana deities. And instead, they just wanted to embrace the concept of meditation and give people options for how they could connect to their faith. So we refer to this form of Buddhism as Chan Buddhism when we were referring to northern China and Korea. And this form of Buddhism in Japan is known as Zen Buddhism. So there are many different forms of meditation practices that begin to emerge. There are martial arts practices like Kung Fu that become associated with Chan Buddhism, seated meditation, and we'll also talk about like calligraphy and Zen gardening as an example. But the idea is that you should meditate as much as possible because deep meditation leads to spontaneity. And by spontaneity, what we're talking about is kind of spontaneous enlightenment, that after seated for hours, days, weeks, months of meditation, that your enlightenment will like suddenly come to you. In Japan, when this form of Buddhism arrives, it begins to blend with Shintoism, and it becomes the dominant faith of Japan for a very long time, essentially up through like the late 1800s, early 1900s. So there are specific art forms and forms of meditation that are associated with Zen Buddhism, such as Zen gardening, ink painting, because if you think about the process of painting, it should be very meditative, right? You're really concentrating on the painting, and it's hard to think about other things. The practice of calligraphy is considered a form of meditation because similarly as ink painting, if you're trying to be very neat with your calligraphy, that can be a very meditative process. It comes about later, but the tea ceremony, which is very famous in Japan, is actually a form of Zen Buddhism because if you were to ever go to a tea ceremony, and we'll learn more in depth about it later when it's in the right historical context, but the tea ceremony is not about like chugging a bunch of tea. In fact, a group of 3 to 7 or more people all share 1 cup of tea. So it's not about the tea. It's about equality. It's about meditating on the space, meditating on the process of making the tea. It's far more about meditation than it is about consuming a beverage. And the samurai engage in a lot of Zen Buddhism as well. But I want to give you 2 specific examples. The first are the Zen meditation gardens. So Zen meditation gardens are very beautiful and very peaceful places to be. So the space itself should allow people to meditate. This is an example of a classic Japanese Zen meditation garden. You can see Japanese architecture right here, which utilizes a lot of natural elements, not only because That's like what was available at the time. But even now, the Japanese utilize more natural elements in their building because it's related to the influence of Shintoism, right? Honoring nature. They utilize a lot of rice paper in their building as well as bamboo because it is highly sustainable. You don't destroy a lot of resources by utilizing those materials. So the idea of a Zen garden is that there is a space that has a lot of sand or gravel as well as big rocks. And I'll use the next slide to show you better. So the way that the rocks are situated are usually representative of something bigger than you. Sometimes they match the rocks to look like the planets in the sky or stars in the sky. Sometimes they set them up to mimic the Japanese islands. So it's a reminder that there are things going on that are way bigger than you. And then the way that the gravel or the sand is manipulated is a big part of the meditative process. And so Buddhist monks and anybody who's practicing Zen gardening will use a rake to create these beautiful patterns. So the process itself is very meditative. You know, if you are into kind of any kind of like ASMR or kind of textured, soothing things, you can imagine the process of kind of dragging a rake through sand or gravel can be really soothing. So that's part of the process. And also, as you can imagine right here, how elaborate this must have been for this person to create this, these patterns of lines, but also circles. But if you notice, you can't see any footprints, right? They had to think about it ahead of time, plan it out, and carefully create the pattern. But just like with mandalas in Buddhist practice, the idea is that you might take a long time to create this. And after you finally finish the lines in the sand or in the gravel, a little squirrel could run across the sand or the gravel. The winds could pick up and mess up all the beautiful work that you just did. So ultimately, it's a practice in non-attachment, right, which we keep discussing. And the other practice that I want to make you aware of is something called enso or enso painting. So the enso painting is a meditative process that starts with a meditation and ends with an ink painting. And so the way that it works is that for many people who do this, they will stand in front of like a canvas or a piece of paper with their arms by their side, and in one of their hands they'll have a brush that's dipped in ink. And then they'll meditate for a long period of time. And rather than meditate on like a verbal mantra or try to just kind of fully clear their mind, what they do is they meditate on the idea of a perfect circle. And they just try to imagine a perfect circle in their head. And they'll do this for however long they want. But the moment they feel like they've really embraced and embodied the idea of a perfect circle, they'll lift their arm and in like one motion, kind of whoosh it around and make that circle. And then they'll open their eyes and they'll take it in. And so what you'll see here in this particular example is that it's pretty beautifully round, but of course it's not complete. The circle itself, right, didn't close. There's parts where the ink didn't fully meet the canvas. And the whole idea is that that's perfectly okay. It embraces this idea in Buddhism, or really in Japanese culture, called wabi-sabi, W-A-B-I space S-A-B-I. Wabi-sabi means that something is perfect in its own imperfection. I really love that idea, and I think about it all the time. And so this is a great example of wabi-sabi. Yes, this circle is not totally perfect. It's not closed. It's not perfectly shaded in. But it's perfect in its imperfection. There's no other circle like it. And thus, it is unique and perfect and beautiful. And these are some other examples of enzos created. And I will ask you to do one of those, and I'll explain that activity. So that is it for now. We'll close that out. Thank you for your attention.